Hi, everybody. I'm Angelo Mandato, and let's get started. Before I kind of dig into the slides, is there anybody here that hasn't developed before? So I kind of get a gauge on how to talk about the code and stuff. And then has everybody developed in Node.js? Or nobody has?
Nobody has.
Okay, all right. So let me get through the first couple slides. So first, this is talking about Lambda functions with VSCode. I'm going to use, with the demonstration, I'm going to use Node.js. Then a little bit about me. This is mainly for the slide later, so if people look at it and want to know. The bigger thing, though, is, which first I got to thank my wife. She puts up with me using all this stuff, so thanks, babe. My experience mainly is a software developer since 2000. I've been doing podcast development since 2005, WordPress since 2006, and then AWS since 2009. I don't count 2007 because it was just using S3 instead of using like FTP. I've also got a product owner certification and also the associate architect certification. So it kind of gives you a little bit about my background. So when I'm talking to you today, I'm coming at you as a software developer, not as like a DevOps person. So I'm hoping that you're going to pick up some things that'll help you kind of develop very quickly from these kind of skills I'm going to show you. So I just said it this way. It's not quite, what's the term? Test-driven development, but it's the path to it, right? So when you're putting together a project, you're going to make a little snippet of code, and as soon as you have enough that it could compile and run, or you can test it. Don't keep coding other things and not knowing if things work. So I have this minimal viable piece of code, another piece of my minimal viable code, and I just keep stacking it up every day until I finally get to that minimal viable product, and that's what you're going to end up using in your final app. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're developing, because that's going to save you a lot of time. So with the minimal viable code concept, you test it as soon as you can. As soon as you have a piece of code that's ready, test it. You can then make unit tests. It'll actually help you think about how you're going to make unit tests to test different areas as well. And then it also is going to show you, which actually when you see my code, you're going to obviously see areas where you're going to want to refactor. And that's the whole point, right? The first version, you just want it to work. Next version, you start doing things to think about things running asynchronously, for example. So yeah, it's the precursor to actual doing test-driven development. So, why are we going to use a Visual Studio Code or some other editor to develop in rather than just the console? The biggest one, in my opinion, is the Debugger. I want to spend a little time on it. If everybody's been developing, let me know and I can go through that quicker. But I kind of want to touch on it because a lot of people don't know the power of having a debugger. And that's really, that's the biggest thing. Upload your code to Lambda Council to test. I kind of scratched that through because it still is kind of easy to do. But if you are developing locally, you can really make it work with your CI/CD pipelines. It's easier to do code reviews when you're thinking about working on it locally, committing it to Git, having another team member or multiple team members review your code. You also have access to a linter when you're in the editor. If you're not familiar, does everybody know what I mean by a linter? So basically, the linter plus the tooltips, it just makes things go faster. And then you're saving time and money because time is money. All right, so requirements, and I'm not going to dig into literally setting up VS Code for Amazon, but the requirements are not high, right? You need an Amazon account, you need a VS Code editor, and you need Docker. And the good news is that Docker is not going to be involved for our use case, right? Sometimes you have to worry about images and stuff like that. The way Amazon has their toolkit for VS Code, you just need to install Docker and then have it running in the background, and everything else will take care of itself. So if the Docker part is scaring anybody, Just think of it as something that's running there, and you just need to make sure it's always running every so often. Yeah.
In Docker, if you're running, if you were to be developing on Windows, would you have how would you have your Docker installed?
You mean Docker?
The actual
Oh,
Docker.
that's actually how I develop is on Windows. So you just get the Windows version, install it. And
That Windows desktop. I think Docker started charging for that.
the version I got is free. There's a open source version. You just have it running in a sys tray, and that's all I did. Now, there might be things you need to add if you're trying to actually do things with Docker, but I'm just having it run in the background. When every time I hit run, the AWS toolkit will send a JS file or JSON file to Docker to start it up with the image it needs, and it's good to go. It's really just emulating Lambda, but on your computer rather than in the cloud. So when you think about it that way, you don't have to think about, it's just performing that emulation for us locally. So, any other questions before I get deeper? All right. So testing in VS Code, making your first application. I'm going to blow through these 5 slides real quick, but you need to know these particular steps because I sat there, I started doing it thinking it would be like a pop-up and I'd do everything in once, but it doesn't work that way. It's probably my only thing I don't like with VS Code is creating the project. But what you first do is you're going to invoke the, I forget exactly what this screen brings up, but it's like where you start activating things that you want to do in VS Code. So you hit your Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P, and it brings up the getting started message, and you just start typing in what you're going to do, which is create a Lambda. And this is the one you want to select. And this, again, this is after installing the extension to VS Code for AWS. So that'll be, when I get slides after the conference, I'll put those links to get those. I didn't want to spend time like showing that kind of stuff. So once you type that in, you're not done. It's going to keep popping up this thing at the bottom. This is why I made these slides. So now you want to pick how you want to code your Lambda function. In this example, I'm using Node.js 14, but there's all the different options you can think of. There's Java, C#. I'm trying to remember what the other one was down here besides. What's that?
Python.
Yeah, Python. I want to say, and Go. Go is in there too at the bottom. So, but in this example, we're using Node.js. And then I'm on a computer or PC, so I had to use x64 in this example. And we're going to do the SAM hello world. You can also do a step function, and someday that'll make more sense. If you saw the keynote, you can see where you would use those. That was a good example. And then Lambda. So finally, you're going to select a folder where you're going to put this project, and then you're going to give it a name. And this is the thing that was, you go through all this step through these pop-ups. If you didn't hit enter here, it would not do anything. So I'm just kind of saving you guys from the frustration of trying to repeat what I did and explaining when you get to this, the actual name of your project, hit enter or else nothing's going to happen and you start over. All right, so this is what's going to happen. It's going to generate this, actually it's going to create all the different files you need, but the big one's going to be called app.js. And then it also will give you this README file, which will kind of explain what's going to happen. So you do want to kind of read that, get an idea what's happening. And this is basically what you're going to see. So here's the actual app.js file. This is where you're actually going to be coding. And before we do anything, and like I was saying before, we now have code, let's test it. So we're going to hit F5 and actually compile it, let it put everything together, emulate the Lambda function, and see what happens. So before we get in further than that, let's start about the debugger too. So when you hit F5, you're invoking the debugging, and what you're going to see is this toolbar at the top. So you have the first two is continue and step step over. And then you also have step in, step out, restart, and stop or disconnect. I wish it was just stop, but I totally get, they have other situations in VSCode where that's a disconnect, not a stop. And then you have your breakpoints. So the breakpoints is where the magic happens. When you're looking at your code, and I'll show you an example here in a second, if you have a line where a function's returning something, and you didn't test this, or you're thinking something's returning wrong, that's where you add your breakpoint. You're gonna double click on the side where you see the line numbers, and it's gonna leave this kind of marker right here. In this example, it's line 20. And what that's telling the debugger is, when you get to this point, stop. Let the cursor fall in here, that way you can see what's happening and step. So here we go. Let's start debugging and see, make sure everything works. So you hit the start. Oops. If you don't have Docker running, this is what you're gonna see. So simple enough, go back, get your Docker running. Now we're testing. So this is the example of the output. So in VS Code, you have these 4 tabs at the bottom, and it's gonna kind of show you what's happening. So this is the output. It kind of gives you the things that's running behind the scenes. I think it works with the SAM command line, which invokes the Lambda and everything, and then it'll get the output, and then it'll send it out. There's some messages that come in here, and I don't even understand what's going on, but that's okay. That's whoever made this is telling us that they're having, the command not started, things like that. The Debugging Council is really where we're going to kind of look until the end. That's going to tell us, hey, this is the output that came from the hello world. If there was errors, we would see them in here. So this is where some of your secret sauce is going to be. Then going back to talking about the breakpoint, this is where we have our breakpoint marked with the little red dot. At this point, we can look at this response that's about to return back from the JSON function and see what's happening. So here's an exact example, actually. So when you put your arrow right over the variable, it's going to have this nice pop-up, and it's going to actually tell you what every value has and what's happening in the data. And kind of going back to why you want to use VS Code rather than develop right from the console, this is the secret sauce, right? Now you can actually see, I did all this code, this is the value it's going to return before it falls into other areas of your code. Or in this example, this is just the end of the function, it's going to return back to Lambda. Oh, I'm missing a slide, but it would have showed in that other terminal the results, that same JSON you saw in the inspector. So far I just kind of went to the debugger and showed how we're going to get started. We got the Hello World app. Now I'm going to show you the actual code that we want to develop. And what I did was I got an API call for getting a random cocktail of the week, and we're going to save it in S3. That way we can display it later on a website. So the goals are, we're going to make an API call, get that drink recipe. We're going to store that result, the JSON, right in S3, so we have it. The web page later will refer to it and display the results. We're going to email myself or whoever to say, hey, this is the recipe this week. And it also will tell me, hey, we know it's updating regularly. And then we're going to put it in production. But being me, being a product owner, I'm going to refactor this into 2 versions. I know the email is like an extra thing, so I'm going to save that for the end, the version 2. All right, so let's get into this. We're going to use the parameter store in Amazon to store settings like the S3 bucket. In the path, we're going to store the JSON file. We're going to use the SDK and the software, and we're also going to make that random API call. And then this URL is a project for another day. You'd probably use like Vue or Node.js or maybe something simple with jQuery to just get that JSON file later and display it on the web. But we'll save that for another time. So Just so everybody sees how this will work. You go onto the parameter store part of Systems Manager, and you can easily add these different parameters. I'm adding two parameters. One is for the S3 bucket, another one's for the actual path where we'll store that JSON file. But in the real world example, you're probably going to pass these parameters as just defines in the actual Lambda function, but your secrets or your passwords, you're either going to put in here or another feature called Secrets Manager in AWS. It depends on what your actual goal is and how if you're going to rotate the passwords, or you're just going to put it in once for any kind of like API calls or things like that. But the thing I wanted to show is this is really kind of still best practice, place to find these settings. A future developer that learns AWS, this is probably the first place they're going to look to see, how do I change this to another S3 bucket? So it's just good practice to kind of get used to this. So, oh yeah, so these are the two paths I picked for the keys for using parameter store. One is cocktail/bucket. That's going to always give me the actual bucket name that I need. And the other one is /cocktail/bucket/key/random, which will be the path where I put the random. All right, so let's start thinking about clearing out this hello world code we had and put our own code. So kind of where you see my red comment, that was all that code that was in there for the hello world. I just gutted it, and we're going to start from fresh. And to think of this, we're going to make a sandwich. And this is just how I kind of learned how to develop. It's create everything you need in the beginning, create everything you need in the end, and then we'll start stuffing the sandwich later. So this is the boring part, believe it or not. So at the beginning of the code, we know we have these two variables from parameter store, and we need to get them. So I like to initialize variables at the top, make them blank. I'm going to require the library code that we need and make sure everything is set up. So in this example too, we're using the East 1 region. And then at the bottom of the source code, where the function returns, I have it set up to, hey, return the S3 bucket in the path, because that's the part I'm working on now. And you just give me a status code. That way, when I'm debugging, I have something I can see. So in this example, we ran F5, we're using the debugger. I'm at the bottom where I have my breakpoint. And you can see when I trace over here, I got my bucket, which is blank, which is correct, because I didn't do anything except initialize those variables. And the key path is blank. Now, if I've made my slide right, we're ready now to start making a sandwich. So basically, I know I got my variables, and I got my return result, but now we really need to get into the meat of it. So our next little piece of code is just, I need something simple to handle my errors. And this is something I kind of developed over time. That way I'm not repeating the same 8 or 12 lines of code to handle an error message. So I'm making this function to make it easy. I can pass it either an error string, for example, or I can pass it an error object, and it'll put the error code in the message and then return a nice JSON result. That way later, if it's in production, I can look at this and know, oh, it's this problem. Then I'm going to use it, right? So I'm going to skip right down to the bottom here, but when I catch an error, I'm going to call that function with the error message, and it handles it. I don't have to retype all those lines of codes to deal with the error message and make a beautiful JSON to send back. Now at the top here, I'm getting that parameter from the parameter store. You might be able to code this with a few less lines, maybe hard code some more things, but I wanted to kind of code it this way so you can kind of see the logic of what's happening. So I got my options that I'm passing to the function to get the path. We're not using decryption. And again, like I said before, you probably will be using a decryption from parameter store for what you're doing. But for this example, we just need to see how it works. And then we're going to get the parameter. And as long as the parameter comes back, we're good. There is a scenario where the parameter is there and maybe it's empty, so we're not going to set a variable. But if there's an error getting it, like, for example, I had a problem connecting the parameter store because the path was wrong, this is where the error will catch it, and it'll send back that error message, and I'll have that debug information. So now we're looking at the actual function. Now that I added this code, ran a debugger again, F5, got to my breakpoint, and now you can see, because I preemptively knew I was gonna be working on it next, I can see these variables in my return result. It's making the whole development, the testing, and the process a lot easier to kind of step through and make sure I'm getting each little piece of code correct. So if you also wanted to see what happens when an error happens, this is a good example where I had the path wrong. I put an extra character in the word cocktails or something. Then this is where my error function that I made handles this error and returns a nice, beautiful, well, it's not beautiful, but a nice explanation that this variable is not there. So now we're ready to start making something besides a burger. Here, we're gonna make that API call to get a random cocktail. You can see I like to initialize variables. It's just a style code I have. And then the config options, again, you could minimize this code, but I just like the readability. And then we're gonna use this Axos to create a object, or create a library that you can use to make HTTP connections or web connections. And then we're gonna wait for that result to come back. When it does, we get the value, and then otherwise we're gonna have an error. This is where, just so everybody knows, I'm not a Node.js developer. I've just kind of learned this over the past few months. But I do know that at some point, when you start optimizing this, we'll want to go back and start using these, change these awaits in certain areas to use promises and then have the wait calls happen kind of asynchronously, if that makes sense, or synchronously, I should say. Right now, everything is in synchronous, so it's all in the order that we're doing it. So it's not quite as efficient. So if you were putting this in production, you might end up, the Lambda functions might end up taking a little bit more time. But for the fact of just getting a first version out, this is the main goal, right? We want something working, not necessarily the most efficient. So again, this is another one where we hit F5, we run the results. And this is the stuff we get from that, the recipe website for the cocktails. So hopefully this is, yeah, Zipperhead cocktail, never heard of it. Has anybody had that cocktail before? So, yeah, but hey, it's random whiskey sour glass. So it'll be really cool to show this on my website, but for now, we're just test data. All right, now we're ready to put the whole meal together. And actually, before I get into that, has anybody had this Wendy's strawberry frosting? It's pretty good. It's pretty good. All right. So now we're going to take this value and we're going to put it in an S3 bucket. This is like the last thing. So now we have an actual working app. Here you can see the parameters again. These first 4 lines, we're going to refactor this. Like this would be the very next thing I do later. And you can use things like a file stream or put the actual text in a stream and then pass it to this function. But just to kind of explain, in Node.js, when you call the library here to do an upload, it needs a physical stream to be able to upload. You can't just pass it a string of the text. So in this case, I just took the file, made a random JSON file in the temp folder, then I reopened it with this stream. That way I can pass it to the function. But yeah, full disclosure, we will change that. Then we upload it to S3. Again, we're using a wait, a promise. That way it's happening synchronously. But yeah, you can see the upload. And I'm reusing this error function too, because I don't want to have to keep recoding, handling an error. So it's kind of, you can see how we're using a little bit of reuse, we're using a little bit of consistency in getting this first version to work. So now, this is the last piece of the puzzle I said would be in version 2. So everything up to now, I can technically send to like my management team and say, hey, I got a working version. Come check it out. So now this version 2, now I'm gonna finally get to sending the email. And this is where for this demo, I didn't get this finished coding, so I did not debug this. So don't copy this code for code. But this is basically what we're gonna do. We're gonna use the SCS library to send an email. We're gonna have it send whoever in the team needs to know that, hey, the recipe changed. And then we're gonna log the error. And actually, I would recode this to use my error function, so we're not redoing this. But the other thing is, this is where then, in your code, you can imagine that command that did the upload to S3 and this could be combined at the same time, and they can synchronously run at the same time, uploading and sending the SCS. So it actually makes the script more efficient. And that then becomes a factor later when we're talking about running a Lambda and getting charged by the millisecond, I believe. So, but again, I'm back to being a developer. I want a working version first I can debug. So that's why I did the example I did. All right, so we're ready to eat. We have everything together. I think, yeah. So the next step will be kind of deploying it. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but before I do that, did anybody have questions at this point? It's okay not to have any. All right. So deploying the app, this is where my expertise is minimal, and actually my wife should be up here because she's deployed a few more Lambda functions than myself. But we're going to use this command line tool in the terminal to deploy, called SAM deploy, and the ---- guided will actually walk us through submitting the app into, or just putting the Lambda function in production. And actually, I was going to say, it'll be asking lots of questions about, it's not fresh in my mind right now, but like I believe it's the cloud formation and things like that. So once we're done do this the first time with the guided, you won't have to use this guided command anymore, because it'll make, like, I believe, a cloud formation file too, which will make it a lot easier to then deploy this in the future. So that's pretty much the gist of it. So again, I appreciate